What's up? It's your boy D Change coming at you with another Daily Dave, here to secondhand dispense you wisdom from podcasts and media that I consume. I've wondered if I would make a good, like, maybe not a YouTuber necessarily. Well, I guess that's what it is. Some sort of personality that regurgitates or summarizes information. There's a channel my friend likes. I forgot what they're called. But they literally just summarize everything for you. So instead of reading a whole book or consuming an entire documentary or movie, they um yeah, they reduce it to like kind of like a 10-15 minute video. And it's like nonfiction and stuff like that. Not necessarily fiction. It's more of a it's more in like the self development, personal development category. But yeah, I don't know. It's ironic because I feel like when I was much younger, this type of medium wouldn't have fit me, like video and audio, just like speaking and stuff like that. I think I was a good listener. Well, I was somewhat of a good listener when I was younger, but I was definitely not a good speaker. And I feel like reading and writing was where I excelled. That kind of flipped at some point because now, I mean, I don't know. Call me narcissistic or whatever. I don't particularly call my writing or my reading poor, but I just don't find reading as like an enjoyable way to gather information as much as I used to. And I just have trouble writing. Like I'm just like I feel too lazy to write a lot of times. But I don't know. Yeah, so anyway, the one thing I listened to yesterday, and I feel like I have a ton, like lately I've had time to kind of listen to a lot of shows. So there's probably a lot I want to cover, but I don't know if I'll ever get to all of it. But one of the podcasts I listened to yesterday was from the James Altucher podcast, and it was with Joe DeSena, who wrote what is the book called? I have to recall it. But he wrote about the Spartans, I'm pretty sure, unless I'm like totally wrong about this. But he like started the like the Spartan races, so that's pretty interesting. And yeah, they barely talked about like the Spartan, like, I don't know, ethos and stuff like that, which is I find really funny. But that's totally fine because okay, is it the book is called, actually, is it a book? Spartan Up, Spartan Fit, and the Spartan Way, and the host of the Spartan Up podcast. So very Spartan-y, right? Very into that kind of, I don't know, tight-knit, tribal, militant, well-organized type of society and culture. So Joe DeSena like grew up in, I guess, a bad part of New York City, like a mafia controlled area, and he ended up working for a mob boss. And he said it was ironic because if these mob guys actually worked as hard as they did in a legitimate business, they would make so much more money. So I guess it just goes to show how in a way crime doesn't pay, like the amount of effort they put in, right? Because obviously, like, there's certain things you got to worry about when you're uh when you're part of organized crime, right? There's just a lot more problems to think about in a way, right? So yeah, I can definitely imagine that line of work being much more complicated, much more difficult to be in. So it's just always glamorized in movies, which I have a very like conflicted view of that, because clearly I love the glamorization, like it's just kind of romantic, you know. A lot of vices can be romanticized really well, but I understand that influence is like negative, you know. Like I wouldn't particularly want that media to be influencing like the youth and implying to people that, you know, this is like super cool and the way to do things, because it's not, you know. Like everyone loved Breaking Bad. I didn't even watch it, but I know the premise. But like realistically, you know, like it kind of glorifies, you know, the aspect of like, oh, I was just a teacher and now I make meth, and it's like, look at this brand new world that's open to me. But I mean, in the podcast they even said like, you know, in the end, like, was it truly worth it for him? Because he still had to go through a lot of crap, right? And I don't know what happens, but I'm assuming it doesn't end so great anyway. So the three things. So he was working for this mob boss, and like his first day of work, he was supposed to clean the pool. That was his job as like a teenager doing part-time work for a mob boss or something. And he said the three things that guy told him were these are considered life lessons for anyone who wants to be in business. Number one, on time is late. You say you're going to be here at 8 a.m., be here at 7:45. That's very Japanese. It's great because I somewhat adapted to that while I was over there in Tokyo. So I do feel like at times I was well prepared for that. But I also feel like life over there can be more structured in the sense that like train schedules kind of dictate, what you do, distance from your house to your office to certain venues like also dictates like the amount of time you have to prepare, right? Because you have to sync up what you're doing with the rest of society overall. Whereas here in like California, Southern California, it's all about cars. Traffic is kind of fluid. I mean, you can, you kind of know, there's clearly like patterns, but it's not as it's not the same. And that's not to say there aren't delays with trains that will be surprises, or they might kind of shift your schedules every now and then. But I feel like it's so much easier to kind of tack yourself on to some sort of consistency, some sort of like rigid schedule over there in Tokyo. So yeah, if on time is late. So, basically what it means is you're like kind of giving the courtesy to someone else to show up early, to be prepared, that type of stuff, right? And I think it's a more difficult concept to understand for say like the average American, and for certain cultures where being late is kind of the norm. I know it's called like an Asian thing, but I'm not exactly sure like who that's supposed to encompass. But I am aware of like this kind of feeling of like just always being late, Unfortunately, yeah, my family sometimes like more often than not falls into that category. So I've kind of grown to accept it, and then I've heard my peers say it, and I've had it reinforced, and I totally believed it. So you automatically assume Asians late, right? And that's how stereotypes are born. But yeah, start asking a bunch of Japanese people, and they will stereotypically tell you, no, you like on time is late. You always gotta show up 15 minutes ahead of time. Gee whiz, aren't Japanese people Asians? I don't know. Just kidding. Number two, you gotta go above and beyond. So his job was cleaning the pool, right? The guy tells him, you clean the pool, you better straighten up the furniture outside. You better clean the shed. You better go way above what I'm paying you, so you make yourself indispensable. Because the whole idea is that you're providing more value to someone, and you're proving to them that like without you they wouldn't be able to not exist, but they're never gonna find what you can do for them. I guess I'm thinking that's like the concept, because of the stuff they talk about later. And then number three is going to be never have your hand out for money. And this is a follow-up to the second one. You bring value to the relationship first, and you'll get paid, but don't worry about asking for it. And this is very difficult because like I hear a lot of people in this position where like they've made their fortunes, they've they're doing relatively well, right? Like in this pandemic, they're not the ones worrying, right? Like I guess that's a tough thing to say, because some people do have really large businesses with hundreds of employees, and in a time like this, yeah, they would be in a lot of trouble. And they're probably worried a lot about like, am I going to, end people's lives basically by cutting them out? But they themselves, like their family's taken care of. Gee whiz, like you lose a few $1,000,000 or something because of this downturn, or more, your company's still worth way more, right? So in a way, like if you're the average American and you're part of the working class, like it's hard to really to relate or empathize when it's like, well, your net worth is like how many multiples of me, right? So I understand like it's not just a black and white situation. But anyway, so it's kind of, sometimes it's difficult to come to terms with that saying, because I do believe it, but at the same time I do believe it's overused as like an excuse for, you know, problems that we kind of just allow to exist. But generally, yeah, it's still a good saying. Like, the more value you provide to people, the more willing they are to reciprocate. The more they see that, you know, you're a positive force for them and their own networks, right? I mean, I definitely believe more in the idea of, like, you know, being generous to other people and allowing them to there's that Three Kingdoms quote, where it's like, I would rather allow the world to betray me than to betray the world. I mean, it's very like morally good and all that stuff, right? That's kind of the idea, is that I'll give and give and give, and they can take as much as they want, but I know that like karma will be on my side or something like that, right? And that's kind of the approach that a lot of these like entrepreneurs, rich people, successful people kind of parrot, because I think they truly believe it. That's one thing, and that type of thinking and those behaviors did help them get them to where they are. Now, there's probably a lot of luck involved, right? Like, they, you know, right time, right place. That happens a lot, right? Opportunity is luck plus preparation. So they were prepared, you know, to eat shit for 10 years, or like, you know, dig the well, or, you know, do 80 hours of overtime or whatever. They were prepared to do whatever it took, and they just had the right opportunities when they came. And that's how they skyrocketed to wherever they are now, right? So that's cool. But in general, I do feel like that is one of those, it is one of those sayings, you know, provide value first, right? And, you know, don't ask for it, so to speak. Again, generally it's very conflicting, because in the creative crowd, people are like, don't fall for the trap of doing work for free. Don't, you know, exposure doesn't pay the bills. And that is absolutely true. That is absolutely true. And I don't think creatives should, you know, give away their work for free, because you never ask like an engineer to be like, hey, why don't you, you know, draft up those plans for me for free? Or you don't go to a project manager and say, why don't you do that for me for free? And then, you know, later on, I'll give you exposure, and then you could eventually get a better job. It's a lot of times it's kind of funny because of how society sees different jobs and stuff like that, that type of stuff happens. So, and I really don't like the whole like trying to put down certain professions because they're like not as hard sciencey, or they're not as like, they don't contribute as much to society. I mean, at some point, yeah, maybe you do measure that, but I feel like that should come at a point when people are actually, you know, kind of like, when we don't have like a shit ton of poverty in a developed nation. I feel like why don't we get past stuff like that? Why don't we get past like maybe living wages or something like that? I know that's not something everyone wants to hear or believes in. So I don't know. Maybe it's always going to be at a conflicting. It's always going to be a very conflicting discussion. But anyway, sorry, I like totally derailed that. So like, again, number one, on time is late. Show up early. Number two, you gotta go above and beyond. Generally, yeah, I agree with that. And then number three, never have your hand out for money. And you know, overall though, that is true. That is still very human to have that impression of like doing favors for people just for the sake of doing favors for them. You know, I feel a lot better when someone gives me more just because they want to, or like they're accidentally generous, right? Like, it makes me want to reciprocate more. And this is kind of messed up because you can still argue it as like oh, it's how they trick you, you know? But the thing is, it's still your choice, right? Like, it's like every marketing advertising tactic or sales tactic of like, oh, I'm gonna give you, you know, here's a free sample. I'm gonna let you try it. You can demo the software for free, 7 days, 30 days, money back guarantee, that type of stuff. It's meant to provide value, allow people to use something, allow people to test something out, and then just say like, okay, listen, if you can't live without it, you're going to want to buy it. But if you don't want to, that's not for you. Don't worry about it. But this is why I feel like the creatives do get screwed over, because they're the ones kind of producing things that don't necessarily get used until, or like they should not, it's a different medium, right? Like it's hard for me to articulate right now, because one thing that's really messed up is if a creative makes something for you and then you go, I don't really like it, but you use it anyway, right? That's really scummy, because that does happen. That definitely happens. So yeah, I don't know how to, I definitely am not in the right state of mind to kind of analyze that and make a better argument for it. But yeah, don't have your hand out for money. I can generally agree with that. Like, I think anytime you do offer a service and you're just like, oh, it's going to be like this up front, like, you know what, it's fair. It's definitely one way to do business, and I would probably approach it that I wouldn't want to deal with like BS from customers a lot, right? So I might approach it that way. But at the same time, like, that might not be the best way to do it, especially with the people I want to work with, right? So it really depends. I don't know. I'm definitely not well versed in that type of like environment or that business transaction. So who knows, But what was ironic about this is that what's his name, Joe DeSena, he he references it again later in the podcast, because he basically became employed by a lot of like mob related people, because his reputation spread far and wide. They all knew he was like the good guy, the boss liked him, whatever, right? So he's cleaning everyone's pools. But then he gets asked to do a favor, or he's supposed to drop something off to someone, and or wait for someone somewhere, and the guy, like, so he's like waiting in the car or whatever, and what he didn't know, and he found out a lot later, was that the guy went inside and like was killing a dude, and he came out to meet him in the car, and they left or whatever, something like that. And he said it was because it was like an architect that the guy murdered, and he said it was because the architect asked for money, like he kept asking for money. Now, see, that's really messed up, because I don't agree with that. Obviously, like, that's a one of those signs of like organized crime, going against morality. Like a lot of times, in the romanticized sense, and I've seen this with like a lot of like East Asian organized crime syndicates. Like they kind of project this idea of like upholding morality and like faith to like traditional values and stuff like that. But I mean, you're just gonna murder people because you have a debt to them. I mean, that's not right, especially since organized crime is really unfriendly to you when you owe them a debt. So I just found that really interesting. But yeah, again, like the lesson to be taught there was that the guy had his hand out, and that was not what he was supposed to do, at least in their world, right? It's a common theme in every organized crime movie or script. It's always like, they always hate the dudes who are just like, oh, where's the money or whatever. They like to treat it like a family and that type of stuff. That's what makes it really toxic, right? Like, it's kind of like businesses that claim to be families. They have that. They're stereotyped as like really toxic workplaces, because yeah, you know what? Your coworkers are not your family. That's why. That's the reason why. So anyway, my computer sounds like it's about to explode. And I'm seeing that like I'm like dropping frames or whatever. It's kind of weird. I don't know why this always happens, but go figure. Maybe it's running something in the background. But anyway, those are the three things that I got from that podcast, and I felt like they were very solid. Like, I feel like very actionable, simple things are the best to carry with you into the future. At least for something like, oh, I listened to it once on a podcast. Later on, you can go deeper. You can listen to it again. You can read the book again. You can take notes. And that's what I realize is part of like learning, right? If we just kind of whiz by everything, like a 1 hour podcast real quick, and I listen to it at 2x speed, so I'm literally only gaining like a minute and a half worth of value from it. I mean, it's still better than nothing, right? But yeah, that's why I wrote it down into a set of notes, so I can keep it with me forever, for as long as I have these notes or whatever. So anyway, something to think about. Just thought it was super interesting, and that maybe I should apply that to my own life. And yeah, so there's probably going to be more of these like nugget like vlogs in the future. But yeah, I hope you're all doing well, and I hope you enjoyed this one. I will see you in the next one. Have a good one.